They came for my son in September 2002. Until that day, I had always thought the Appalachian legends were just stories told to entertain tourists. My name is Deborah Ann Collins, and I've lived in Bryson City, North Carolina, all my life. I'm 58 years old now, but back in 2002, I was 37. I worked as a nurse at the local hospital and raised 2 kids on my own, Jason, 14, and Emily, 11, after my husband Rick died in a car accident 3 years earlier. Our house sat on the outskirts of Bryson City, about 3 miles from downtown, at the end of a narrow country road that led deep into the woods. It was a small 2-story home built by my grandfather in the 1950s, with a wide wooden porch and a backyard that bordered the forest of Great Smoky Mountains National Park. The nearest neighbors lived about half a mile away, so we were pretty isolated. Bryson City was a small mountain town of roughly 100 residents, nestled at the base of the Appalachian Mountains. Most people worked in tourism, guiding visitors through the national park, or in the local logging industry. I chose nursing because it was steady work, something that let me support my family while staying close to the mountains I loved. The ridges surrounding Bryson were thick with oak, maple, pine, and fir trees. In the fall, the leaves turned brilliant shades of gold, red, and orange, drawing thousands of visitors who came just to witness the beauty of the season. The forests were full of wildlife: black bears, deer, raccoons, opossums, wild turkeys, and dozens of bird species. Since childhood, I'd heard local legends about hairy wild men, or mountain people, said to live in the most remote corners of the Appalachians. Old-timers told stories of huge, man-shaped creatures covered in fur, walking upright and possessing unbelievable strength. Most folks dismissed those tales as harmless folklore meant to amuse out-of-towners. My grandfather, Wilbur Collins, the man who built our house, sometimes talked about strange sounds he'd heard in the woods at night, not the calls of any animal he recognized, but something between a human voice and the roar of a large beast. He once claimed he'd seen enormous barefoot tracks near the creek. I never gave much thought to those stories. I figured they were just the product of lonely imaginations from people who'd lived too long in the deep woods. But everything changed on the 23rd of September 2002. That evening, I was driving home after working an extra shift at the hospital. It was a typical autumn day in North Carolina, around 60 degrees Fahrenheit, the air cool and crisp, the leaves just starting to turn. I'd worked from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., covering for a sick coworker, and I was exhausted. My kids were staying with my sister, Sarah, in town and planned to spend the night there, so I intended to take a hot shower and go straight to bed. The drive home took about 15 minutes along a winding mountain road. I drove slowly because, at dusk, deer often wandered onto the road and hitting one could be fatal. Soft country music played on the radio. The window was slightly open, letting in the cool night air. About a mile from home, while passing through a dense patch of forest, I heard a sound that made me stop the car. It was faint, a whimper or a soft cry, something like an infant or a small animal in distress. The sound repeated every few seconds with a tone of pain or fear. I pulled over to the shoulder, turned off the engine, and listened. It came from the woods to my right, though it was hard to tell how far away. I reached into the glove compartment, took out my flashlight, and stepped out of the car. As a nurse, I couldn't ignore the possibility that someone or something was hurt. Even if it was just a wounded animal, I had to check. Carefully, I walked toward the source of the sound, shining my flashlight along the ground as I moved. The dry leaves rustled under my feet, and I tried to step lightly so I wouldn't startle whatever was out there. After a few minutes of searching, I found the source of the sound. A small creature was sitting at the base of a large oak tree. At first glance, I thought it was a young raccoon that had lost its mother or been injured. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't any animal I'd ever seen. The creature was about the size of a 6-year-old child, covered in dark brown fur that was almost black. It sat pressed against the trunk, trembling and whimpering softly. One of its arms was held tightly to its side, as if it were hurt. When I raised my flashlight and shined it on its face, my breath caught. That wasn't an animal's face, it was almost human. The features were shaped like a primate's, a pronounced brow, a wide nose, and a slightly protruding mouth. But what struck me most were the eyes, large, jet black, filled with tears. They radiated intelligence and fear. Those were not the eyes of an animal. They were the eyes of something that could think and feel. The creature looked at me and made a sound that was almost a word something between mama and please. It reached out a hand toward me, the way a frightened child might when wanting to be held. That hand was also covered in fur, but the fingers were long and dexterous, with dark nails that looked more like claws. My first instinct was to run. This thing clearly didn't belong to any known species, but it was small, scared, and clearly injured. The nurse and mother in me overpowered the fear. I slowly stepped closer, speaking softly and gently, the same tone I used to comfort terrified children at the hospital. The creature didn't flee when I approached. Instead, it moved toward me. I could now see that its left arm was badly wounded. A deep gash ran along the forearm, still oozing blood. It looked fresh, possibly from another animal's claws, or from a sharp branch during a fall. Carefully, I lifted the creature into my arms. It was heavier than I expected, maybe 60 or 70 pounds, but it let me hold it without resistance. Its fur was thick and soft, its body warm. It nestled against me like a frightened child, and gradually, the trembling eased. As I carried it back to my car, my mind raced to make sense of what was happening. Clearly, it was some kind of primate, but there were no wild primates in the forests of North Carolina. Maybe it was an escaped exotic pet, or even a specimen from a traveling zoo. But the nearest zoo was hundreds of miles away. I placed the creature gently in the back seat and started driving home. It stayed quiet the whole way, occasionally making soft noises that sounded more like speech than animal growls. In the rearview mirror, I could see its eyes reflecting the dashboard lights, watchful, curious, almost aware of what was going on. When we got home, I brought it out to the back porch and made a makeshift bed with some old blankets and pillows. I carefully cleaned the wound with warm water and wrapped it in bandages. The creature remained calm through the whole process, whimpering only now and then but never trying to bite or scratch me. Then I brought it some food, apples, bananas, peanut butter sandwiches, and a cup of milk. It ate eagerly but gently, using both hands the way a child would. It even tried to drink from the cup, though most of the milk spilled onto its fur. Throughout the whole time, I felt as if I were caught in a strange dream. Part of me screamed that I was making a huge mistake. Bringing home an unknown wild animal could be dangerous, even insane. But another part of me saw something entirely different. A lost, wounded child who needed help. When it finished eating, I gave it a large towel to dry off and keep warm. It wrapped itself tightly and lay down on the improvised bed, making soft, melodic sounds almost like a lullaby. I thought maybe it was trying to soothe itself. I decided to let it stay on the enclosed porch for the night. It was surrounded by glass and stayed fairly warm. In the morning, I planned to contact the local authorities, or maybe a veterinarian, to figure out what to do next. Maybe someone had lost an unusual pet. Or maybe, just maybe, it was a species science had never documented. Either way, I knew I had to turn it over to professionals. I went back inside, locked the door, and left the porch light on just so it wouldn't be afraid of the dark. Through the kitchen window, I could see her lying comfortably on the bed, wrapped in the blanket. Her large, dark eyes occasionally lifted toward me, as if checking to make sure I was still there. I tried to lie down, but I couldn't sleep. All through the night, I heard soft sounds coming from the porch, not cries or whimpers, but gentle humming or quiet murmuring. The sounds had a rhythm to them, soothing, almost melodic, and eventually, around 2 a.m, they lulled me into sleep. When I woke up at dawn, around 6 a.m. on September 24th, the first thing I did was check on my strange guest. But the porch was empty. The blanket had been neatly folded, the dishes were cleaned, and there wasn't a trace of her left. At first, I thought she'd somehow escaped through a crack or opening in the glass enclosure. But when I looked closer, every panel was intact. The door was still locked from the inside. The only explanation that made sense, if you could call it that, was that she had somehow opened the door, slipped outside, and closed it again. But that seemed impossible for a creature so young. I stepped outside and walked around the house, searching for footprints or any sign of where she might have gone. Morning dew covered the grass, but there were no tracks, nothing at all. It was as if my mysterious guest had simply vanished into thin air. Around 8 o'clock, I was sitting in the kitchen, still trying to make sense of everything, when I heard something outside. At first, it was faint, the cracking of branches, the rustling of leaves, like something large moving through the woods. Then came deep, rough sounds, not quite roars, but not human either. I looked out the kitchen window, down across the backyard toward the tree line, and what I saw made my heart stop. Standing at the edge of the forest, about 50 yards away, were three enormous figures. Even from that distance, it was clear they weren't human or any animal I'd ever seen. Each one stood at least 8 feet tall, with impossibly broad shoulders and arms that hung almost to their knees. Their bodies were covered in thick, dark fur that rippled slightly in the morning breeze. They stood upright, balanced easily on 2 legs like people, but their proportions were all wrong. And their faces, God, their faces were what terrified me most. Even from across the yard, I could see the sloping brows, the powerful jaws, and the glint of their eyes beneath the trees. Those faces held intelligence, ancient, primal intelligence, mixed with a strength and wildness humanity had long since lost. The 3 creatures stared directly at my house. They didn't move, they didn't make a sound, they simply stood there, watching. There was a stillness about them, a patience, a quiet resolve that reminded me of parents waiting for a lost child to return home. And then it hit me. They weren't just watching. They were waiting. These were the parents, the family of the young creature I had found the night before. Somehow they had tracked her scent or followed her trail all the way here, and now they stood at the edge of my property, watching, assessing, deciding what to do. One of them, the largest, likely the male, stepped forward and let out a deep, resonant roar. It wasn't angry or aggressive. It was a sound that vibrated through the ground and made the kitchen windows rattle in their frames. The roar didn't sound like a threat, it sounded like a question, a command, as if it were saying, "Where is our child?" That was when I realized how much danger I was in. 3 massive, unknown predators were within yards of my home, and if they believed I'd harmed their young, they could tear the house apart in minutes. My house was sturdy, but I doubted the doors or windows could withstand a direct attack from something that strong. I slowly backed away from the window, careful not to make any sudden movements that might draw their attention or provoke them. My plan was simple: lock myself inside, call the police, and wait for help. But when I reached for the phone, the line was dead. Either those things had damaged the wires somehow, or it was just an incredibly unlucky technical failure at the worst possible time. Back then, I didn't own a cell phone. In 2002, they were just starting to become common, especially in rural towns like mine, where service was spotty at best. The nearest neighbors were half a mile away, and to reach them, I'd have to step outside, cross the open yard under the watchful gaze of 3 towering creatures that could crush me in seconds. I crept back to the window and peered out again. They were still there. But now they were communicating with each other, making low, guttural sounds that were unmistakably deliberate. Not random noises, not animal grunts. They were talking. The sounds they made weren't just animal growls, they were a kind of primitive language. Every now and then, one of the creatures would point toward my house, and the others would nod in response. The smallest of the 3, likely a female, began to move slowly toward the house. Her movements were careful and deliberate. Every few steps, she would stop and sniff the air, as if searching for a familiar scent, trying to find her child and understand what had happened to it. When she reached the porch, the very spot where I had kept the young one the night before, she stopped and inhaled deeply, her chest rising and falling as she took in the scent. Then she let out a soft, low cry, exactly like the one I had heard from the little one the night before. She was calling for her child, hoping it would answer. She waited several minutes, then called again, but there was no reply. It became clear to me that the young one had already left during the night, probably finding its way back to them somewhere in the woods. The female turned and walked back to the other 2, making a series of distinct, throaty sounds, clearly communicating what she had found. The largest of the 3, likely the male, listened intently, then looked back toward the house. This time, something was different in its gaze. It wasn't anger or threat, it was curiosity and maybe even gratitude. Somehow, it seemed to understand that I had cared for its child, and that realization changed the way it saw me. The 3 of them remained there for a few more minutes, still communicating in low, deliberate tones. Then, slowly and carefully, they began to retreat into the forest. They moved with quiet grace, occasionally glancing back at the house, but showing no signs of aggression. The large male was the last to leave. He paused at the edge of the woods and stared at me for a long moment. Then I swear, he nodded, almost as if in farewell, before disappearing into the trees. I stood at the window for another half hour, scanning the forest, but they never returned. Gradually, the woods came alive again with the familiar sounds of morning birds calling, leaves rustling in the breeze, the distant hum of insects. It was as if the strange visit had never happened at all. Only when I was completely sure they were gone did I step outside. The first thing I did was walk to the spot near the tree line where they had stood. There, impressed into the damp earth, were footprints clear and unmistakable. Enormous tracks, at least 18 inches long and 8 inches wide. They were deeper and sharper than the smaller prints from the night before, made by creatures that must have weighed close to 400 pounds each. Each print showed 5 toes, with faint impressions of nails or claws at the tips. But what shocked me most was how the tracks were laid out. They were all from 2 feet, no sign of hands, knuckles, or anything to suggest they had walked on all fours like normal animals. These beings were bipedal, moving upright like humans, with advanced coordination and clear intelligence. I fetched my old film camera from the house and took several photos, from different angles, using a ruler for scale. The pictures weren't great, my camera wasn't professional, but they showed enough detail to capture the size and shape of the footprints. Then I walked around the property, checking for any sign of damage. To my surprise, there was none. They hadn't tried to enter the house, break a fence, or trample the garden. It seemed they had come only for one purpose, to find their lost child. And once they knew it was safe, they left. That evening, I drove into town to pick up my kids from my sister Sarah's house. I told her everything that had happened, but she was skeptical. She thought I had probably rescued an injured raccoon or otter, and that its mother had come back for it during the night. The humanoid creatures, she said, were probably the product of stress and exhaustion after my long shift. Jason and Emily, though, listened with wide eyes. Jason, always fascinated by biology, studied the photos of the footprints carefully. He said they didn't match any known animal in North America. Emily, ever the practical one, asked why I hadn't called the police or animal control. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that something extraordinary had happened, something that defied logic, but felt utterly real. The next day, I decided to visit the local office of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Agent Mark Johnson, a man with over 20 years of experience in the department, came out to my property to inspect the footprints himself. He examined them carefully, taking notes and photographs. After some time, he admitted that the tracks did look unusual, but he ultimately concluded they were most likely the distorted prints of a large black bear. According to Johnson, bears sometimes walk on their hind legs, especially when trying to get a better view or catch a scent. On soft ground, he explained, bear tracks can resemble human footprints, particularly if the claws don't leave clear impressions. His theory was that a small group of bears had passed through, perhaps looking for food or drawn by the scent of the creature I had found. Still, even he acknowledged that the size of the prints was extraordinary for any black bear native to our region. Most black bears in the Smoky Mountains weigh between 200 and 300 pounds, 9,135 kilograms. But the tracks in my yard suggested something much heavier, possibly twice that size. He speculated that the animals could have been grizzly bears wandering unusually far south, though that would have been highly improbable. Johnson collected soil samples from several of the footprints for further analysis and promised to consult with wildlife experts at nearby universities. A few weeks later, he got back to me. The experts had reached the same conclusion. The prints were, in all likelihood, from exceptionally large black bears, perhaps part of an unusually big family group. I wasn't satisfied with that explanation. I understood why the authorities wanted to keep things simple, acknowledging the existence of an unknown primate species in the forests of North America would challenge decades of established science and could easily cause panic among locals and tourists alike. Still, I couldn't ignore what I had seen. In the following weeks, I began digging into local archives and old stories, trying to find anything that might explain what I'd witnessed. To my surprise, I discovered that reports of encounters with wild men or hair-covered giants in the Appalachian Mountains stretched back for centuries. Early European settlers had written accounts describing huge, human-like creatures in the mountain forests. And long before the settlers arrived, the Cherokee people, who had lived in these lands for generations, told rich oral legends about cannibalistic beings they called the Sulkalu, or sometimes the Soso, said to dwell in the most remote corners of the mountains. In the 19th century, regional newspapers occasionally published the stories of hunters and loggers who claimed to have come face to face with powerful, man-shaped creatures deep in the woods. By the 20th century, these reports had become less frequent, but they never completely disappeared. I found several documented cases from the 1972nd and 1982nd, involving hikers and locals who described encounters with strange, upright figures. Most of these accounts were dismissed as hoaxes, drunken misidentifications, or attention-seeking fabrications. But my experience had been far too vivid, too detailed, too coherent to be the product of imagination. I had seen those beings in full daylight, from close range. I could describe their faces, their posture, their eyes, every feature burned into my memory. That autumn, I contacted several researchers studying the Bigfoot phenomenon in other parts of North America. One of them, Dr. Greg Wright, a cryptozoologist at Ohio State University, was particularly intrigued by my account and by the photos I had taken of the footprints. According to Dr. Wright, the Appalachian Mountains offered an ideal habitat for an undiscovered primate species: dense forests, abundant food, rugged terrain, and limited human presence. These conditions, he said, could easily allow such creatures to survive for centuries without detection. He also suggested that the isolation of certain valleys might have helped preserve remnant populations of species long thought extinct elsewhere. Dr. Wright asked for permission to publish my story and photographs in a professional journal dedicated to cryptozoology. The article appeared in spring 2003, titled "Unidentified Primate Group in the Mountains of North Carolina: Witness Testimony and Physical Evidence." The publication drew attention from other researchers and enthusiasts across the country, and soon, several small expeditions were organized to search the forests around Bryson City for further evidence. But none of those searches turned up anything conclusive. No new tracks, no photographs, no physical proof of any kind. Whatever had visited me that September morning, whatever had watched my house from the edge of the woods, had vanished back into the wilderness, leaving only memories, photographs, and questions no one could answer. Perhaps those creatures moved on after that incident, realizing their presence was no longer a secret. Or maybe they simply became more cautious, learning to avoid the places where they might cross paths with humans. Either way, no one else in the area ever reported another encounter like mine. My children grew up with the story, each interpreting it in their own way. Jason became a biologist. To this day, he believes that the existence of an undiscovered primate species in North America is theoretically possible, though extremely unlikely. Emily became a teacher. She often uses my experience as an example in her classroom, a lesson about keeping an open mind, about not dismissing something simply because it doesn't fit within what we think we know. More than 20 years have passed since that night. I still live in the same old house on the outskirts of Bryson City. I've been retired for 10 years now, though I still work part-time as a nurse at a local clinic. The forest behind my home remains as lush and mysterious as ever. And sometimes, especially on quiet autumn evenings, I step out onto the back porch and just listen to the sounds of the wild. From time to time, researchers, journalists, and the merely curious come to visit, hoping to hear my story firsthand. Most are polite, respectful, though I can see the skepticism in their eyes. I don't blame them. If I hadn't lived through it myself, I might doubt it too. But I know what I saw, and I know it was real. Somewhere in the endless forests of the Appalachians, there are beings that mainstream science still refuses to acknowledge. They are intelligent, social, family-oriented, and they prefer to stay far from us. Maybe that's for the best. The modern world isn't always kind to what it doesn't understand. Sometimes I still think about that small creature I found in the woods that night. I like to believe it survived, that it grew into a strong, healthy adult, and that somewhere out there, it remembers the woman who fed it, tended its wounds, and kept it safe. I hope that memory made it a little more tolerant of people. And I think too of its parents, the towering beings who came for their child that morning. Their behavior still humbles me. They could have attacked my home, smashed the doors and windows, and taken their young by force. But they didn't. They understood I meant no harm. In fact, they knew I had helped. They chose respect over violence. That moment revealed something profound about them: intelligence, restraint, and even compassion. These were not mindless wild beasts acting on instinct. They were capable of judgment, of empathy, of decisions. In some ways, I realized they were more civilized than many people I've met. After that encounter, I made only one real change in my habits. I no longer step into the yard alone after dark, not because I'm afraid, but out of respect. The night belongs to them, and I won't intrude on their peace. During the day, I still wander into the woods now and then to gather mushrooms, trim the hedges, or just walk among the trees. But I always make a little noise first, letting them know I'm there. If they're still out there and in my heart, I believe they are, they hear me long before I ever see them. It's a kind of understanding between us, a quiet, peaceful coexistence. Modern science continues to uncover new species, even in regions long thought to be fully explored. Perhaps one day, technology will allow us to document these hidden forest dwellers without disturbing their way of life. Until then, they will remain part of nature's great mystery, the secret heartbeat of the wilderness that keeps our world fascinating, wild, and unknown. My encounter with them was a privilege, one that few people will ever experience. I witnessed a form of ancient life still surviving in the shadows of the modern world, unseen by most, yet undeniably real. And it reminds me, even now, that our planet still holds secrets, and that nature always keeps her greatest surprises for those willing to look closely enough to see them.